Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Prescribing Prosperity Podcast with your hosts, John and Alex Soutsos. Guys, this is part 2 of a conversation. We teased it when we last left, so it's good to see you again. But Alex and John, let's just jump right in here and talk about where we left things, which was retirement.
Yes.
How do you deal with it? How do you cope with it? And John, what about real estate? I mean, a lot of people do downsize in retirement. Some people sell estates and move into something smaller, but not everybody does that. So how do you know what's right for you?
Bill, it's interesting. In the olden days when you and I were younger, it was a fait accompli. You raise a family in a house if you can afford to own a house.
Right.
Back then, it was easier to afford a house. You raise a family like the Brady Bunch in a nice big home, and I guess I'm dating myself here. Half the generation's not going to understand what I'm talking about.
I'm right there with you, John.
I'd like to know how he afforded that house given his income. But anyway.
Well, it was California and it was sparsely populated at the time. Anyway, so you have a big house, you raise the kids. The last of your kids leaves the house. Now you're empty nesters. And traditionally, what would happen in that generation, I'm referring to people in the 60s, 70s, maybe even into the 80s. They would sell the house, get a smaller place, maybe a bungalow, or move into a condominium or a townhouse. And away we go, free up some capital, either to pay off the final debt of the home or free up the capital just to invest and generate additional income. But today it's a different story. Houses are not so easy to acquire for the younger people. So sometimes parents have to sell a house and downsize just so they can free up some capital to assist their adult children so they can purchase a home.
Or conversely, they have to keep their larger home because the adult child has not moved out, and they need the larger home longer than they anticipated.
Yeah, and so that's a good point, because we know of friends who downsized on the assumption of, hey, I'm an empty nester. We're empty nesters. We don't need this big place. And lo and behold, one of the adult kids is having all sorts of financial difficulty, and it becomes a problem, and they regret their decision. So it is not a straightforward decision. There is no general rule for everybody. It must be a personal decision. And other things to consider are the cost of the upkeep, the size of the home, mobility issues. Now, on this subject matter, people of our generation, Bill, and older, used to want to move into one-floor housing, either a bungalow or condominium, in order to have one level that they need to tackle. But that I think that's a mistake. I think if you need to go be on one floor, and I'm speaking now for 80% of the population. 20% of the population may have health issues that they cannot help. And so that is a reality, and they have to do that. But for 80% of the population whose mobility is a function of their diet and lifestyle, they should not be assuming they're going to be on one level and then continue to let themselves go from a health perspective. You really need to be focused on maintaining your health so that you don't need to be constrained by mobility issues in your decision making about what your next property is going to look like. So I thought I'd elaborate a little bit on that. And unlocking capital, as we already mentioned, can be used to help an adult child get their own home, pay off, or use the additional capital to invest and generate additional income to enhance the lifestyle in retirement. So making a decision, and the exact timing of downsizing, if you do decide to go through with that, can also be a factor of interest rates in the market.
I think it's also worth mentioning that, I think people feel as though it's a rite of passage, for lack of a better term, to go through the downsizing procedure. But the reality is that a lot of people become very comfortable in the features of the home that they have. I'm thinking of one of my best friends growing up. His parents, they've talked for years and years about downsizing, but his mom loves their home. She loves all that the home has to offer.
Yep.
She would like a smaller version of that exact home. Well, unless you're going to build it custom, it's very difficult to go into the real estate market and find exactly what you're looking for. And so, for a number of different reasons, it's actually worked to their favor that they've kept their existing family home. And from a selfish standpoint, I love their family home. I love going to visit them. I hope they keep it for as long as they can. I think for a lot of people, though, they need to consider that and make sure that, just because they feel, they should downsize doesn't necessarily mean that they have to downsize, and they got to make sure that they're happy with the circumstances that they have. Another consideration could be potentially having live-in help. We've talked a lot about, the frailties of people in their later years, and you may or may not need somebody to provide in-home help for you and in-home support. And depending on the degree of in-home help that you require, having them be a live-in assistant might be beneficial. And therefore, you might need a home that has that capability, has enough space to accommodate somebody like that. So just considerations. I'm not trying to say there's one right or wrong answer. As my dad said, it's all very subjective, and it's up to each individual to determine what's right for them. But these are just things that people should be going through, in their mind, creating a bit of a checklist to say, okay, do I feel like this is something that I'd like to have?
No, it's fair. I mean, and the other consideration too, in a real estate market like we're in now, a lot of people could be looking at the reality of they could sell their home thinking that they are going to downsize, pay off that debt, and then realize that what they thought they could afford, they can't afford because, I know you've got the same situation in Canada. Suddenly you're looking at like, whoa, a market that is just beyond imagination in terms of costs for a lot of people. It's true.
You don't necessarily even need to sell your home to unlock capital. My dad mentioned the home equity line of credit. There's also reverse mortgages that you can basically sell a portion of the equity in your home to a financial institution and get that capital out of your house right away. So basically, if you were to sell, 20% of the equity share of your home to another institution, they get whatever 20% of the price of the home is when you sell it at the end of your life, or whenever you choose to liquidate that piece of real estate, in exchange for getting that money up front, which you could then use for whatever you need, whether that means investing, whether that means paying for your lifestyle and at the present, or helping a family member. There's no limit to what you can do with that capital.
Yeah, no, and I just would throw this in, and John, you may want to give me an amen on this or correct me if I'm wrong, but reverse mortgages, at least here in the States, are much more highly regulated than they were initially when they were first introduced. But I would suggest that if you are looking at that option, that you go talk to somebody like John or Alex. I think turning to a personal financial advisor would be wise in that case.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So amen to you, Bill. Yes,
you, John.
at all times, it's good to have a detached third party who can provide perspective and some knowledge, because we can't all know everything, and people are busy with their lives. So, and we make it's our job to know these things. So yes, it would be a good idea. I'm generally, and I'm speaking in general terms, there's always exceptions, but I'm generally not a fan of reverse mortgages. I would rather secure a home equity line of credit while I'm working, have it on standby, and should I need it, I get into it. As I mentioned in our previous episode, I think this is where people also need to think about permanent insurance. People, when they're younger, are looking for cheap insurance when they initially start their families, for obvious reasons. And then when the kids grow up, they say, well, I don't need insurance anymore. Well, the reason for insurance changes. There's no point in your life, unless you're independently wealthy. There's generally, for most people, there's no point in your life when you don't need some insurance. And so what is insurance? It's a hedge. It's a hedge against the unknown. And so you want to have that ability to protect yourself financially. And so permanent insurance becomes of much higher priority. And I'm saying, even if you may want to even consider this before the end of your first term. So a lot of people get 20-year term insurance.
Mhm.
Even before that 20-year term policy elapses, you may want to start investigating permanent insurance in order to build an alternative asset value in a financial vehicle that you can draw upon for income. And it would be tax-free income, because if you're putting up the insurance policy at a financial institution as collateral, you're not paying any interest on it. The interest will accrue and capitalize until you die, and then they just take it from the proceeds of the death benefit. And so that's a great way to have tax-free income for individuals. So I think that's another thing that people need to be paying serious attention to.
You mentioned the idea of insurance, and that brings to mind a subject that a lot of people are not necessarily comfortable with for very good reasons, and that has to do with the other fact of retirement. Is typically that means we're all a little bit closer to passing on from this world, as it were. And we have to prepare for that. We have to recognize that it might be like something you don't want to talk about, but how about the death of a spouse, guys? Who wants to take that one?
Well, that's death of a spouse is very difficult. You may not want to think about it or talk about it, but the reality is one of us is going to go first. And unfortunately for all of us here today, it's usually the guy. And not always, but the probabilities are in favor of the guy going first. What is important to factor in is, if you pass away, it's not just a matter of, okay, I'm going to just roll everything over to my spouse. You have to start thinking in terms of, has my spouse been an active participant in the financial planning process throughout our lives together? Or has one person led that quest? And it's not always the men who are leading that quest, but in our generation and previous generations, it usually was the men. And I don't know what it is today in current generations, if it's equal or still the guy. But it's important to think about the spouse. Okay, so if you're the person who is tasked with the financial planning throughout the entirety of your career, you need to say, okay, well, if I'm gone, who's going to give the advice? Who's going to be there to provide guidance? And so you may want to create a relationship or use an existing relationship and say, would you be able to provide some guidance to my spouse should I predecease her? And that is something that's really important. The other thing you want to consider is, if your spouse passes away, does the spouse want you to inherit everything and then you decide how it gets distributed to the kids upon your demise? Or is there some level of inheritance immediately and the majority still carries on with the surviving spouse? So these are conversations you need to have in the course of creating a will.
Yeah, and they're difficult ones. I would guess, too, that this is an uncomfortable conversation for both of you and anybody who's a financial advisor, because ideally, I think you both would like, and every financial advisor I know would like to know that the couples they advise, they're advising jointly. So
Yes.
that in the death of in the death of one of the spouses, the other partner in the relationship is already up to speed, if you will, in terms of what comes next.
Up until now, I've been speaking about financial matters,
right?
But there's a huge psychological impact, and I've seen it over the course of my career quite a few times. And in the cases I'm recalling right now, is usually the husband would pass, and the spouse was almost emotionally and psychologically helpless if he couldn't make a decision about anything.
Right.
And this is where you want to have the conversation with your spouse. Say, look, if something happens to me, you need to have a close friend. You need to have access to a professional help in order to help you cope with this situation, because it's emotionally very, very difficult for a lot of people to cope with that. And interestingly enough, though, I will tell you that the conversation is not as difficult as the perception might be. When you get up to 60, 70 years old, people are very cognizant of where they are in their stage in life, and they're not so fearful necessarily about the next phase of your being. It's something that couples often will have a conversation about before it happens, and I think it's more traumatic for the children, whether they're minors or age of majority. It's more troubling for them to have that conversation. But for the older folk, a lot of people are really they're ready. And in fact, in the course of seeing people from retirement to their ultimate passing, I've gotten to they've gotten to the stage where they would say to me, John, I've had enough. I'm 85, I'm 90, I'm 95. I really don't want to live any longer. I'm ready to go, and they're at peace with it. And so it's not a tough conversation, and they're very realistic, and you can have the conversations with ease.
It helps things along psychologically as well as fiscally, if both couples are engaged with their financial advisor.
That's the optimal situation.
I can't imagine my wife not knowing, in terms of, we don't go to the financial advisor separately. We go together, So I guess the question I have now, and Alex, I'm directing this at John, but jump in here. But for obvious reasons, this conversation seems easier to flow with John. Is one of us is going to go? I mean, you're right, John. The numbers and the facts would seem to suggest that we're the people that are going to go first. What happens with that final spouse? What, in terms of they're left, and then at some point they too are going to end this phase of their life. They're gonna pass away. They're going to move on. What happens then, guys?
Okay, so before we get to that point,
okay,
there is another intermediate step that has to be taken care of, and that is getting your house in order. My dad, unfortunately, passed at a much younger age than he should have, and he was told by the attending physician, "You need to go home and get your affairs in order." And you don't want to be getting your affairs in order under that kind of duress. You want to be getting your affairs in order well in advance. So it's you get to 55, you get to 60. Now's the time to start thinking about funeral arrangements. Go and make those funeral arrangements. Pay for it if necessary in advance, or on an installment basis. It depends on your financial circumstances, but it's the time to start making those decisions, deciding where you want to be interred, how you want your body to be disposed, etc. Religious discussions, all of those things. So the financial affairs must be in order. It's beyond just a will and power of attorney. It's also funeral arrangements, and some people even get involved in. I know I had one client, it was a lady, and she decided, okay, here's where I'm going to be buried. Here's where the reception's going to be. Here's the food that I want to be served. Here we're allotting this amount of money for it. And hey, you know what? Hey, when you do that, it makes it so much easier on the surviving spouse. There's a lot of stress.
They're already dealing with a lot.
Yeah, they're already dealing with a lot, so it's good to have that. And I know there's been the last couple of decades, there's been emphasis on cheaper funerals and all that. And in some cases, that is appropriate to go that route. But there is a very valuable service that are provided by funeral homes these days, and internment centers where they can provide facilities for a religious service, or even the meal after the funeral. So I think it's worthwhile getting all these things arranged in advance without being told by a doctor, go home and get your affairs in order.
I know for me, I'm not going to settle for the. I don't want the prison food being served at my funeral. I'd like my attendees to be well fed and well consumed alcohol wise, and so I want it to be high quality till the end.
My Greek heritage and my wife's Italian heritage has transferred very well into Alexander's preferences in life.
Well, it appeals to my maybe not necessarily my Scottish heritage, but it does appeal to my Irish heritage. That's for sure.
To make sure everybody's well lubricated, Bill.
We want people happy and well fed and well consumed, as it were.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. So just to quickly put a bow on this, we, Dad, why don't you just quickly run through what happens to the assets of all of for the spouse, the first spouse.
So here in Canada, we have a tax-free spousal rollover for assets that are held jointly with certain right of survivorship, and that's typically your primary residence. It's typically your retirement accounts and your tax-free savings accounts and other registered accounts with the government. They have a beneficiary designation, so it's not joint with right of survivorship, but there's a defined beneficiary. And when you have a defined beneficiary or joint with right of survivorship, the asset rolls over on a tax-free basis, and there are no tax implications. Non-registered assets or business assets have to be looked after separately. In the case of non-registered personal assets, you definitely want to have them joint with right of survivorship, assuming your relationship with your spouse is good and all of that. You want to joint with right of survivorship, so it rolls over on a tax-free basis, and they can get access to the money quickly. For business ownership, obviously, you need to have professionals involved. You may need a lawyer. Again, you might need help with insurance. There's such things as insurance business partners, and you have to put an insurance policy in place so that in the event of one business partner dies, where is the money going to come from for the other business partner to pay out the estate? So that person's spouse is looked after. And so that's where you need some business insurance to look after things. So all of these things need to be factored. But for people who do not own small businesses, then it's pretty straightforward here in Canada. Where the complexity occurs is on the death of the second spouse. And on the death of the second spouse, the rule in Canada is, and we eliminated inheritance tax in Canada in 1971. And on the elimination of the inheritance tax, the government introduced capital gains taxes, which have a 50% inclusion rate. At least they did originally. That's oscillated over time. It's still at 50% for the moment for most people. And so there isn't an inheritance tax. The way it works is your non-registered assets are deemed to have been disposed at the moment of death. So all capital property, whether it's a secondary piece of real estate or capital assets like stocks and not so much bonds, but mostly stocks. I suppose bonds that are traded on the market will have this provision as well. They're deemed disposed at the moment of death. So a capital gain calculation must be done for capital property, real estate, stocks, bonds, and then subject to a 50% inclusion rate that then gets added to the final tax filing for that individual, and they pay taxes accordingly. So that's the least of your worries. The big problem here in Canada, and I'm not sure if it's the same in the US, I suspect it may be the same, with registered plans like in Canada, the RRSPs or the Registered Retirement Income Funds. What happens is you are deemed to have disposed at the moment of death, and the entirety, 100% of the value, is added to the income in the year of death. And that's usually the biggest tax hit. So typically people don't have a lot of money in non-registered assets. Typically most of their assets are in registered accounts. So if you have $1 million, $2 million, whatever, $4 million, boom, in their final year, you're in the highest marginal tax rate, and you're giving here in Ontario 54% of that. I know there's some Americans that are cringing listening to these numbers. 54% of that goes to the government. And that's where where again, permanent insurance comes into play. Is you can have an insurance policy where the death benefit which is paid tax-free to the beneficiary of the insurance policy, and it can be the estate, it can be the spouse, and typically you want some of it to go to the estate so it can pay the final tax bill. And that's what happens in a family relationship when the second person passes on. Have I covered all the bases there, Alexander, or have I missed something?
Well, probate, I think which is, there's no inheritance tax anymore, as you mentioned. It's been eliminated, although I think some people still believe that exists. But what people usually confuse that with is probate, and probate is just the legal process by which the will is validated by the courts in order to determine that it is the true last intent and will of the or last testament and will of the individual who has passed away, and that is a 1.5% fee that is charged on assets over $50,000. And Dad, I don't know if you want to discuss this now or if you want to put a pin in that, but what are some strategies that people can do to minimize probate and avoid paying that 1.5% fee?
I think people make much ado about very little when it comes to probate. People tie themselves into financial knots to avoid a 1.5% tax. Meanwhile, the registered account is getting dinged at a rate of 54%. I don't think people should go out of their way to try and avoid probate. I mean, if it's possible, wonderful. If someone is terminally ill and they know they're going and they want to gift their capital property to an adult child, I think there's an opportunity to avoid probate. If you have an insurance policy that can help, if you want to make an adult child joint with right of survivorship, but then that has its own complexities. That's the kind of stuff you want to do if someone is terminally ill with a very limited lifespan. If someone is not terminally ill, if they're in relatively good health, adding an adult child as a joint owner on a piece of property can create incredible complexity on inheritance. And this speaks to the issue of having multiple children. So you have 3 kids, 2 of them have moved off to other parts of the world or country. One is still in the same locality as the parent, and they take on the responsibility of looking after the parent, or if they need looking after, but even just, for conveniences, whatever. And sometimes they will be added as joint owner on a bank account or on investment property or even on the house to give financial flexibility to that individual to deal with the estate. And then the question comes up, well, if you've designated child A to be that person, and all of a sudden they become the owner of the house or the owner of the large bank account or investment account, the other 2 or 1, 2, 3, 4, however many other kids are involved, the kids say, hey, wait a second, that's not yours. That belongs to all of us. And obviously, Bill, people are people, and some people try and take advantage. And so that's why.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, surprisingly, people do take advantage.
True story here. I'll just interject in here to make sure point. I knew a woman. She had a brother. She had been appointed executor. There were only 2 inheritors when her mother passed away. The entire estate went to the 2 of them. And I've long lost touch with her, but for the entire time I knew her, they were involved in lawsuits against one another over who was going to get what. And she kept telling her brother, you are diminishing the estate because all the legal fees are going to be paid for out of the estate. But yes, I can only imagine how much more complex it gets if you've got 3 or 4 people who are like, wait.
Yeah. So Bill, fortunately, this issue has been resolved in Canadian courts in a landmark case called Pecor versus Pecor. And that is, it's been determined that in the event that there is an adult child that's a joint owner on property, unless the parent stipulates it in writing prior to their demise, that property is automatically considered by the courts to be held in trust on behalf of all children.
Good decision.
Problem resolved.
Yeah.
Now, that being said,
court.
Yeah, they can go to court all they want, but
no. But if I'm saying, like, if one of the children, for example, a case that I was dealing with recently, the one of the siblings is the joint signatory on the bank account for the remaining parent, and she was threatening to just deplete the entire account and take it out herself, saying that, well, it's my account, I'm the joint signatory on the account, it's my money. And the other siblings were like, no, you're not. Rightly so, for them to state that she is not the owner of that account. It has not been stipulated in the will, as my dad mentioned. And therefore, they may have to go to court. If she were to ever do something, if she were to ever pull the trigger, liquidate that account, they would have the right to go to court and seek resolution.
And there are legitimate cases, and I had one with one of my clients where there were two children. One of them was in a marriage that dissolved, but for 30 years after the dissolving of that marriage, the spouse continued to pursue their former spouse financially, even though they had resettled with another person. They continued to pursue it, and it created a massive headache. And the mother said, well, you know what? That child's not going to get anything because, one, they've demonstrated they were financially irresponsible, and B, that my money could be taken by that nutty first spouse. And so she documented her intention that when she passes away, the money goes to the other adult child, and that other adult child then is able to help their sibling whenever they need help financially, but not with any lump sum all at once, because the former spouse is continuing to pursue them financially. Yeah. So things can get complicated, but we do have a framework here in Canada that will assist in this process.
Good. And the lesson I'm taking away from this is that when you sit down and you make your will, if you've got a circumstance like that, you need to be specific about it.
Yeah, you do. You do need to. As long as you document things, it makes things so much easier. And when you document it, bring in a third party to act as a witness. And if you can get a notary public or a lawyer, even better, as a witness. But that's what you want to do. Is it's great to document, but make sure you have a third party that's not attached to be able to prove that, yes, this was done in a fair way.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we talked a little bit earlier about the process of choosing an executor. Dad, why don't you just run down some of the responsibilities that an executor can expect to handle?
Being an executor is a very large responsibility. You have to take inventory of all of the assets of the individual, all of the debts of the individual, legal documents prepared and transmitted to the financial institutions that hold assets so that they can release assets at the appropriate time when you get the probated will done. You have to track that. You have to file a tax return, a final tax return for the individual. Once the assets are inside the estate, you then have to, when the estate is dissolved and liquidated and distributed, you then have to file a final tax return for the estate. And if you speak to a tax specialist accountant, they will also tell you that in certain complex situations with people who own businesses or in just very wealthy individuals, there's a way where you can file multiple tax returns for an estate in increments in order to minimize taxes. And I don't know the intricacies of that, but that is part of what is the responsibility of an executor. And so this is why we said earlier, you want to make sure you have someone has familiarity in the financial world or familiarity with administrative duties and tasks, and is someone who's focused and can identify a task and ensure that it's resolved on a timely basis.
And what would you say is the normal timeline to get everything dealt with from the time, the final spouse dies until everything is resolved? Is usually 12 months, 14 months?
I think as a general guide, you want to allow for a full year.
Okay.
Not that it can't happen sooner. Obviously, if things are in order or they're relatively simple, they can happen in 3 months, 6 months. But I think generally speaking, if you say a year, that's generally a good timeline to assume for the distribution of the will. Sometimes it takes years and years. You get people who contest and all this nonsense. I had a situation with one client who actually had was maintaining a secret life and had a second spouse.
Whoa.
Yeah. Whoa. And so that surfaces all of a sudden. Luckily, the individual who had the two spouses had already made provisions for that person, but the first spouse didn't find out about it until after the fact, or either that or it was a deathbed confession. So
was going to say, there's a middle finger from the grave.
Yeah, I've learned so much from my clients, especially in health matters. And, there were points in time when parents were alienated from their children and they had nobody. And I ended up being the person they were leaning on emotionally. And it's what we do for a living is far beyond financial affairs in some cases. And, the regulators may not want to hear this, but it's just a matter of relationships. The important thing is to keep your nose clean and stay out of people's financial affairs. But oftentimes the financial advisor is left to provide some emotional support for people who end up being quite lonely and alienated or from their adult kids. So, yeah, very, very interesting stories.
Well, Bill, I think that that pretty much wraps up everything that we wanted to talk about with the relation to the death of the final spouse, and I think that's pretty much it for the series that we've been working on now for several months, which is financial planning for life events.
Yeah, for those of you who maybe have missed some of those, when you go to look at the catalog of podcast episodes, they're labeled. If you're curious, you can go back and listen to them. This one is easy if you just want to go back to the previous podcast, and you can get into you can dive right into the whole issue of retirement and what you need to do in terms of getting ready for retirement. And I would encourage you to do that. Alex, I know you've got a revamped website. Is that the best way for folks to get a hold of you who don't know you, who are thinking maybe they would like to have a conversation with you?
Yes, absolutely. The website is medwealth.ca, med-wealth.ca. Yes, we just revamped the website. We also have an email address. People can reach out to us at info@medwealth.ca, info@med-wealth.ca. And we've got an exciting couple episodes coming up next, Bill, which I don't know if you want to touch upon, or I can just quickly shout them out right now.
Oh, give us a little tease on them. Go ahead.
Well, we're going to have our first returning guest to the podcast, and that is Kim Moody, who joined us to talk about tax planning here in Canada. Kim is coming back to talk about taxes in professional sports, as well as tax planning for leaving the country if you are looking at potentially becoming an expatriate. So
don't be put off by, tax conversations. No, Kim knows his material, and he's a great guest. I'm glad to hear he's coming back.
Just for clarification, because that is surprisingly a common name, he makes sure he always puts in his middle initial. So it's Kim G. C. Moody. That's G like George, C like Charlie. Kim G. C. Moody. Just to emphasize a little bit about our website, we do have an events tab on the website. We encourage listeners to go on our events tab and check out what upcoming events we have, dinner presentations, webinars, etc.
Excellent. And Alex, anybody else you want to tease forward in terms of podcasts?
Just that one for now. We're working on a few different guests, but I know one of my best friends, he loved Kim's appearance, and so when I told him that Kim was coming back, he was jumping up and down with excitement. I told him I was recording today, and he goes, "Is this the Kim episode?" I said, No, that's coming, but he can't wait. Neither can I.
Kim is a very colorful individual in more ways than one.
He is indeed.
Yes.
He's welcome back anytime he wants to show up. That's great.
Absolutely.
That is great. For those of you who are listening to this podcast who are not subscribers, I would suggest you subscribe. Just reach out and hit that follow button, that subscribe button. That's easy to do. The benefit of that is you don't have to keep track of when new podcast episodes come out, because when they drop the new episode, you're notified. And then you can give it a listen. It's really that easy. I would ask, too, that if you like the podcast, if you find it useful, you find it entertaining, you find it informative, share it with people. Tell people about it. We appreciate that. Word of mouth promotion is a really powerful tool, and we would welcome it. And thank you for sharing it with other folks. Until next time, I'm Bill Tucker, thanking you for taking the time to listen today on behalf of John and Alex and everybody at MedWealth. Thanks. We'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.